We have two great American authors on stage together, but who have written both about the Middle East, but with very, very different backgrounds. Susan Abulhawa is of Palestinian background, family from the Mount of Olives, born in Kuwait, now resident in the States, and is the most read Palestinian novelist of all time. And particularly her Mornings in Jenin, regarded internationally as a great classic. To my left, Larry Wright, Pulitzer winner and author among many other songs, musicals, scripts, and novels. Also author of The Looming Tower, regarded by many as one of the great modern classic non-fiction works about the Middle East in general, but 9/11 in particular. And these two authors have two very different approaches to the same subject. And what I'm going to do in this session is to, first of all, invite both of them to make a sort of personal statement laying out their take on the subject, maybe Larry first and then Susan. And then we'll try and mesh it together in conversation for half an hour before opening it up to questions. I should just like to say that this is obviously very contentious issues. People will feel very strongly about them. And we quite understand that some people may disagree strongly with anything that is said in the panel, but please hold on. We will have questions at the end, and we will try and encompass all views from all communities and all points of view in that discussion. Okay, so Larry, do you want to take first your story of your encounter with the Middle East?
How about that? And that sound, I'd like to have one of these just to walk around the house so my family would pay attention to me. I was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, and that required me to do 2 years of alternative service. And I was, a Dallas boy. I had really done very little in the way of foreign travel. And but I had to get a job that was 50 miles from home. I was all right with that. I wanted to get as far away from the United States at that moment as I could. It had to pay very little, and it had to be nominally in the interest of the United States. So I went to the United Nations thinking they would give me a job that would pay very little and send me far, far away. And they said, no, we don't do that. But here's a list of American institutions abroad. And one of them, the American University in Cairo, had an office across the street at 866 UN Plaza. So I walked across the street. I didn't know we didn't have any diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time. I knew something dimly about the 1967 war. This was 1969. I'm not even sure I knew what language they spoke, but I walked across the street. And 30 minutes later, the person who was interviewing me said, "Can you leave tonight?" That should have been a sign, right? And I said, "No, I can't leave tonight. I haven't packed. My girlfriend's back in Boston. I haven't told my parents what I'm doing. Can you leave tomorrow?" "Yeah, I can go tomorrow." So the next day I flew to Cairo, and I taught my first class the next morning at 9 o'clock. And I loved my time in Egypt. I adored my students. It was for a very provincial young man from the middle of America who had little idea about the rest of the world, it was a great introduction to another culture. And so bear in mind this was a culture in which a society that had broken off relations with the United States. And yet the people loved Americans. The Russians were everywhere, and they were widely hated. But after 9/11, I went back to Egypt because I was writing about Al-Qaeda. And much of Al-Qaeda was born in the prisons of Egypt. So I spent a lot more time back in Egypt. And what really struck me is the governments were friendly, but the people were hated America at that time, and it was very upsetting to me. I had written about I had written a movie called The Siege with Denzel Washington and Bruce Willis and Tony Shalhoub. And in there, I summoned up some of the experiences that I had had living in the Middle East, and to my horror, saw the idea was about what would happen if terrorism came to America. This was 1998. And what if it came to New York? And it was a box office bomb because Muslims were objected to being depicted as terrorists. But it was the most rented movie in America after 9/11. So this was sort of the trajectory of, my accidental wandering. It was a very American story. The naive American wandering into a culture he has little understanding of, and coming back very much changed by that experience. But the culture that I experienced had also changed during that period of time.
Is it on? Okay. So I was born into it. My parents were refugees from the '67 war. My entire family, or most of them, were chased out of their homes. And I was born in Kuwait. I grew up in Kuwait for part of my childhood, but then I was able to return to Jerusalem. My grandmother actually snuck me in, and I lived in an orphanage in Jerusalem until I was about 13 years old. And Israel realized that I was an undocumented person, and I was deported at the age of 13 from my ancestral homeland, where my family is actually rooted for hundreds of years, verifiably so, in one single spot in East Jerusalem. So I came to the U.S. at that age, and I actually went to college for medicine, and I was working as a biologist. I built a career in research and pharmaceutical research as a neuroscientist. And at the beginning of the second Intifada, I sort of became something of an activist in and around that time. And I was very frustrated with what was being written in the media about us, and about the situation itself, which I knew to be untrue. So I found myself, out of frustration, writing letters to the editor, and then that graduated into op-eds. And I was quite surprised, actually. The editors kept asking me for more stuff. So that was kind of my indication, my first indication that I could write. So then 9/11 happened, and sort of unbeknownst to me, the higher ups at the drug company where I worked were quite annoyed with my op-eds that were appearing in mainstream media, like the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example. And following 9/11, a massacre happened in Jenin, and I instinctively went there immediately because I knew what was being reported in the press wasn't what was actually happening, because I had friends on the ground. And it ended up that I was one of the first international eyewitnesses to the immediate aftermath of what happened there.
Do you want to just, for those who don't know, what happened in Jenin?
So Israel attacked, Jenin is a refugee camp, and it was a center of Palestinian resistance, and Israel kind of went in and leveled the camp in many ways. People were buried under the rubble of their homes. It was a massacre.
The
Israeli
view
military.
would be that these were terrorists, presumably.
Right. Well, of course, anything we do. I'm called a terrorist. Everybody's a terrorist. Anybody who sort of opposes Israel, or any Palestinian who aspires to liberty and fights for it, as is our right to do, is sort of either an anti-Semite or a terrorist and whatnot. So Yeah, so when I came back, I very soon found myself without a job. I mean, the combination of 9/11 and my political activism really kind of landed me in hot water. And so I was a single mom without any savings, now with no income, with no family, and I was terrified. It was December 22nd, just a few days before Christmas, and 2002. I woke up the next morning and started writing about Janine, and what I thought was just going to be kind of, public diary turned out to be a novel, and I just kept writing. I mortgaged my house, I went into massive debt, and I kept writing until I had a novel, and it took years finally to get it published, but it ended up being about an international bestseller, and it was translated into 28 languages, and here I am.
So, to inspiring story anyway for any writer, with politics apart. But American interests in the Middle East. Maybe we start with Larry. What would you say American interests are in the Middle East? Maybe and tell your story about Mr. Crane.
Oh yeah. Well, traditionally there are two main interests that America has in the Middle East, and that's Israel and oil. And oil is interesting. The way in which oil came about in Saudi Arabia was King Abdulaziz, who unified the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was an incredibly impoverished country, and very little, there's very little agriculture at all. Just goat herding and fishing, but it was an economy of tremendous scarcity. And so an American tourist named Charles Crane, if you ever happen to notice Crane on toilets, that's the guy. He made a great fortune out of bathroom utilities. And he was wandering around the Middle East, and he went into Saudi Arabia, and he took pity on the fact that the people were so poor. And he had an audience with the king. And he said, I'd like to help you. How can I help you? And the king said, if you could find us some water, that would transform our land. And so Crane hired American geologists to go into Saudi Arabia to look for water. And they came back and they said, well, we got good news and bad news. You ain't got no water, but we found a lot of oil. And this was prior to, this was right after World War I had established oil as being the propellant for shipping. And when they went off of coal into petroleum, that was the moment that oil became the number one energy driver. And that's when Saudi Arabia became important. And it was not so much for America, but for Europe. Which didn't have the kind of petroleum access that, for instance, Texas did. But America had a growing interest in keeping the sea lanes open and keeping power going to allies in Europe. And so Saudi Arabia became an important ally. And at that time,
When are we talking now? What year are we in?
Well, this is an ongoing thing from the moment that Churchill and Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz met in Suez. That was when a kind of alliance was formed, and Churchill gave King Abdulaziz a wheelchair, and that was a signal of American friendship that was very meaningful to the king. And so after that, Saudis began coming to America to get educated, and there was a long-standing correspondence. And ever since then, essentially, Saudi Arabia has been seen as being an ally of uncertain utility, but certainly an ally. And Israel became a point of division between the U.S. and all Arab countries. Although it's been my observation that Arab countries have done very little for Palestinians. You know, there are pledge drives every year where people make great pledges to help Palestine, and they actually never actually pay up. The Palestinians aren't allowed to become citizens in most of the Arab countries, and it's been I think there's a political interest in letting this problem fester.
Susan, so do you think these two prime interests, supporting Israel and having this alliance with oil-rich Gulf countries, are fundamentally incompatible, or is that the basis for the instability, in a sense, and the confusion often of American Middle East policy?
So I think, those are certainly elements to U.S. support of Israel, no doubt. But there's this wonderful book called The Lobby that's written by Walt and Mearsheimer, two professors, one at Harvard and one at the University of Illinois, in which they describe the influence of the Israeli lobby. Much of U.S. policy, foreign policy, is actually driven by, and the case is really made wonderfully in this book, it's driven by narrow self-interest domestically. Israel has the most powerful lobby in this country. It's called AIPAC. And through AIPAC...
even more powerful than the gun lobby?
Absolutely, yeah. As a matter of fact, I mean, in Washington, they just call it the lobby, and everybody knows what you're talking about. And they wield a tremendous amount of influence. In other words, so in people, politicians, congressmen and women who've sort of veered off script have found themselves at re-election either being zoned out by gerrymandering or finding their opponents getting millions and millions of dollars from all over the country to defeat them. So this has happened to several politicians. The first politician to write about it was Paul Finley, who actually passed away recently. He was a congressman for 12 years. It happened to Cynthia McKinney. And many others sort of find themselves at the target of AIPAC's ire. And so there is a fear in Washington of being targeted by AIPAC. So a lot of policies get pushed through in that way.
If I was an Israeli sitting here, I'd say, but there'll be a natural equality of two democracies, that there is a moral bond between America and Israel. It isn't just a narrow self-interest, and that after the Holocaust, that it's the American moral duty to support Israel alone in the Middle East, and that it's a kind of moral imperative as well as a narrow domestic interest.
Well, that's the democracy thing. I mean, that's the myth, right? That's exactly that's what's embedded in popular imagination through actually multi-million-dollar annual public relations campaigns. Israel is an apartheid nation that has multiple tiers of law that are applied to people between the river and the sea based on their religion and nothing more. Whereas Palestinians are subjected to apartheid-like conditions, limitations of water, limitations on freedom of movement, home demolitions, and all sorts of things. There are Jewish-only roads. There are Jewish-only
again, if I was an Israeli, I'd say maybe in the West Bank, but Arab Israelis have full democratic rights.
No, they do not. No, they absolutely do not. And as a matter of fact, there is a law in Israel that forbids any political party forming that advocates for equality between Jews and non-Jews. No political party can challenge the Zionist nature of the state of Israel. So no, they do not. They are given a vote. But they are they're disenfranchised in many ways, including, for example, following Israel's conquest of Palestine, even just the 48 territories, through various, sort of laws that they implemented or that they inherited from the Ottomans or the Brits and so forth, basically have designated 93% of the land for the exclusive use of Jews. It cannot be leased or purchased by non-Jews, and it's and there's all sorts of ways that Israel does this by sort of giving ownership of the land to the Jewish National Fund and things like that. But what's happening? Israel is a settler colonial nation that was born from a political movement called Zionism in Europe, and before the Holocaust. And its primary aim is to dispossess the indigenous population and take their place.
Again,
Yeah.
to argue the counter case, that there have been many moments in Israeli politics, obviously, when there have been all sorts of politicians in Israel that have embraced equality, a coming together.
That has never happened, actually.
A lot of the Labour Party in the 60s and 70s.
There's never been an embrace of equality. There has been rhetoric of peace negotiations and whatnot, but it was never based on equality, and it was always even the Oslo Accords. And you can see in practice, what it resulted in, and basically it bought Israel time to colonize more and more of the West Bank.
Let's go back a little bit in terms of time. We're moving forward. Larry, so American interests after the Second World War, not always dominated by support of Israel. Suez is an example of America acting against Israeli interests and stopping the whole Suez, the joint French, British, and Israeli plan to attack the Suez Canal.
Yeah, that was in 1956, and the Israelis conspired with the French and the British to take over the canal to keep Nasser from nationalizing it, and Eisenhower said no, and it was a telling moment and never repeated, but it had consequences not just for Israel and Egypt, but for the continental powers who would. France and England would never be in the front rank of.
This was the last moment, in the sense of the old-style imperialism.
Exactly.
The European nations trying to dominate.
The threat was, "We'll call your note." They were both bankrupt countries from the war, and the U.S. was, essentially the banker. But I'd like to skip ahead a little bit on, because there was in terms of American interest, I should have neglected something. Which prompted Jimmy Carter and his successful negotiation of peace at Camp David, which there were two reasons for him. One was that it was pretty clear that if there was going to be an engagement between the United States and the Soviet Union, a nuclear engagement.
We should just explain that in between these two events, the whole Cold War has happened.
Right, yeah.
And Egypt is now, in a sense, a satellite of the Soviets. It's using Kalashnikovs and SAM missiles. And Israel has now become the American base, using a lot of American weaponry.
Right, they were the forward projection of the Cold War. And it was the most dangerous place for American and Soviet interests. It might come to a collision that might actually result in a nuclear war. And this was something that was very concerning to Jimmy Carter. He also was a deeply believing Christian. And as a matter of fact, he's still teaching Sunday school. He's 94 years old. And he's been teaching Sunday school since he was 19 years old and a midshipman at Annapolis. But he brought together two men, Menachem Begin, who had been the head of Irgun, the terrorist organization, and Anwar Sadat, who had been an assassin So you talk about how hard it is to make peace. Think about that. Who are less likely to make peace and they were all deeply believing religious figures, and they all had a sense of prophecy guiding them into this moment, and they were the least likely people imaginable to be able to make peace, but they did. And two things. One is they had political courage, and they were willing to stick it out for 13 days. But the other thing is that Carter told me there were two parts of that Camp David Accord. One was peace between Egypt and Israel, and the cost to Israel was to return Sinai, which was a bitter thing for Menachem Begin. He had always been an expansionist, and the idea that they would have to surrender territory was a hard pill for him to take.
And it had biblical resonance and so on, Mount Sinai.
Exactly. But the other part of it was that the second part of the Camp David Accords, which has never been implemented, is that Israel and the Palestinians would negotiate peace. The Palestinians weren't present at Camp David because they were led by the PLO, and for political reasons, Carter couldn't bring them to Camp David. So the Egyptians took it on themselves to represent the Palestinians. And at the end of Camp David, Carter believed that he had gotten Menachem Begin to agree to no more settlements for a period of 3 months while he negotiated peace with the Palestinians. Well, that never happened. And Carter said he lied about it as soon as he got back to civilization. But it was a disappointment. And every peace attempt since then, including Oslo, has been an attempt to realize the unfulfilled promise of Camp David. And it's sad to think that that this could have all been resolved 40 years ago. But the relationship between Israel and Egypt is better now than it ever has been. It wouldn't be true if it weren't for that singular agreement. But it could have been a much more successful agreement.
Susan, as a Palestinian, was Camp David a major backward step for the Palestinians in that case?
So I want to just sort of back up to the impetus for Camp David. Prior to 73, Egypt had actually been trying to make overtures in the international community and with Israel to negotiate something. But as Lawrence said, Israel had expansionist ideas, and they still do. And they were colonizing the Sinai. They were building settlements and planned to keep it forever. But it was only after Israel realized, after the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, when Israel realized that Egypt was going to be a military threat to them, that they actually agreed to come to the negotiating table. And I think it's important to point that out. Palestinians, in all of these sort of negotiations that people always talk about, made really the only real concession, and that was to relinquish our claim to 78% of historic Palestine. That was the basis.
1948.
1940, right,
boundaries.
right. Israel conquered Palestine in two stages. The first stage was in 1948, in which they conquered 78%, and then in 1967. So Palestinians, so all of these negotiations were basically about establishing a Palestinian homeland in 22% of our historic homeland. But the first thing Israel did, which is very much like what they did after Camp David, was to go back and do whatever they want. They'll sign agreements, and then they do kind of whatever they want, much like what early settlers in this country did with Native Americans. We'll sign an agreement, and the other side thinks you're working in good faith, and next thing you know, they're coming and knocking down, they're marching you on a trail of tears and whatnot. And something very similar happened to Palestinians. I mean, all this time in the whole process that people call the Oslo negotiations, Israel had been building Jewish-only settlements on confiscated Palestinian land, and as a result transferred 250,000 illegal settlers, Israeli settlers, into Palestinian territory. So there's really nothing left for Palestinians to develop a state, and this has really been Israel's goal all along, is to not only sort of take all of Palestine and colonize the whole region and sort of expel as many Palestinians as they can, but there's expansionist designs in the whole region. And when you listen to the rhetoric of some of the hardline settlers, there's this sort of dream of greater Israel, which we can see in some ways as being implemented. I mean, there was a white paper in 1996, and I think this is important. I'm sure you know about it. It's called the Clean Break.
So looking forward, we now have this moment when Trump is talking about the deal of the century. Do you think? I mean, is there any way that a Trump government can possibly produce a deal which can be anything other than the surrender document for the Palestinians?
Well, finding a solution to this problem is, for one thing, it is a political problem. It can be solved politically, but it will require tremendous compromises on both sides because they're both so entrenched. And there's very little left of the peace movement since all the suicide bombings in the early 2000s. And in Israel, and I have to say the Palestinians have never been blessed with great leadership, and also still there's not much in the way of love on the part of the Palestinians for their leadership. So there was a time, I think, when a two-state solution might have been a possibility, but with the annex of the land around the Jordan River and the encirclement of the Palestinian villages, it looks more and more like the design is to create cantonments that would be isolated from each other and really pretty much under military control. I think this is. I'm one who really loves Israel, and I admire the history of Israel, the story of the Jews seeking a homeland and so on. I've got a lot of problems with the history, but I also think that these are people that are so traumatized by history that much of what goes on in their politics is a reflection of that, and I think that it's unfortunately being transferred into the Palestinian population, and so we're going to see people working out of trauma.
The trauma has been
traumas,
yeah.
and it's going to be very difficult when you're in a position of such a shaken psyche as both sides have to come to an agreement.
And yet, Susan, you're oddly optimistic. You don't feel that it's all over, that history has dealt a terrible hand to the Palestinian card. You remain hopeful.
Well, both. I mean, I do think history has indeed dealt us a terrible hand, but I am hopeful. I want to just first sort of back up to the language that you use as sort of both sides. This kind of language that creates this illusion of parity between a nuclear power and principally unarmed civilian indigenous society. So there are no two sides in this any more than there were two sides to the Holocaust or two sides to apartheid or two sides to slavery. So I take issue with that sort of framing.
Well, both sides have suffered a diaspora, wouldn't you say?
I think, I mean...
Certainly both sides are deeply traumatized by their past.
Well, not entirely. Yes, European Jews, absolutely, but Arab Jews did not have that, don't have that same experience. So this idea...
We had the experience of, during the 1950s,
But with the creation of Israel, but no,
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about. I mean, it's the
Just
Jews
come back
of
from-
Europe who
I've just come
have
back
this
from
kind
Algeria,
of
which
trauma.
used to have a huge Jewish population.
Right,
Now,
but
yeah.
this you're talking about after the creation of Israel, and we're talking historically in Arab lands. There was not this issue, and this idea that there had been this unified Jewish world community is not something that ever existed prior to Zionism. Prior to Zionism, no European Jew looked at an Arab Jew and said, "Oh, that's my brother." That wasn't real, and so let me
Susan,
please
could
let
we-
me just
we've
finish.
got literally
Yeah.
5 minutes. Just
Yeah.
try and look.
But my point is, like, there's a lot of
Zero.
mythology being
How long? Zero. So we could round up on. So
Yeah.
time for questions, though, huh? Yes. So I'm sorry. No. Well, 2 minutes. Just finish that point and looking forward.
My point is that a lot of these mythologies have to be challenged, and the assumptions we make that there was this sort of unified Jewish world community that was yearning to return to Palestine, that just isn't real. It's not real. The creation of Israel was a very tidy, happy ending for European sins that we had nothing to do with. And this foreign nation was imposed on us that stole everything from us, from home, heritage, language, food, everything. And so Palestinians are an indigenous population that are fighting a settler colonial state that's hell bent on erasing us from history. And I am hopeful because I actually am involved with a lot of activist organizations, and the more Israel looks like apartheid South Africa, the bigger global activism against Israel grows. So there's this dichotomy, and I do feel hopeful looking at the trajectory of history in other areas where these kinds of injustices have imposed. But I believe the road is long and hard and bloody, unfortunately.
Thank you for summarizing it so quickly. Larry, just to finish off, the old problem with American policy was that their two allies hated each other, the Saudis and the Israelis. Now, however, they seem to be sort of closing in as against Iran and seeing each other as major allies against the new threat. Is that going to make the American policy in the Middle East easier or more difficult?
Well, American policy is always confused by the Middle East because we know so little about it. And when I was young, the Saudis and the Iranians were allies. Even when Khomeini took over, the Saudis continued to think that Iran was their ally. And, Israel is now friends with Turkey. And, the constellation in the Middle East is constantly evolving. So you cannot put a pin in it and say, this is it, because it's going to change. And that complicates planners. And I think it is, because it's such a complicated problem, my feeling is that, the United States probably should keep a little more distance between itself and the problems of the Middle East.
I think we've run out of time for anything except questions. So please, any questions? This gentleman at the front here. Absolutely. One coming here.
Thank you. Excellent debate, by the way.
Thank you.
And I'll leave the history of mankind to decide between the Palestinian cause and the Israeli domination without any bias. I just wanted to shift back to the topic at hand. In the recent 4 or 5 years, we have seen an interesting catalyst that's being played in the Middle East, which is the Sunni-Shia dynamic. We never had a let's get all the folks together and, gang up against Iran. And I'm not taking sides. It's interesting to see that the dialogue has shifted where we are calling almost like one nation as the enemy. From an American context, what does the panel think? Is that the right strategy for America long term, or is it a short term tactical advantage?
Larry, do you want to start there?
Well, we're talking about an Islamic civil war, in one in which, I think it's totally foolish to choose sides. And when we talk about Iran, in my opinion, it's essentially been captured by a theocratic cult. And it is a dangerous country, and it does want to extend its influence. And of course, if you're Iranian, you think you're surrounded by, there's not another Persian country in the world. In that way, they are similar to Israel. There's no other Jewish country in the world. They are alone in the world, and they want to surround themselves by allies. And it used to be that Iran.
So they look to the Alawites. They look to Lebanon Shias, and they look to Yemeni Shias.
The Shia crescent, and
the majority in Iraq that are also Shia.
Yes. Now, with Saudi Arabia, our relationship to Saudi Arabia is far less consequential than it ever has been. Much thanks to Texas and the fracking industry. The price of oil, $60, I'm telling you, that takes the air out of a lot of terrorist movements because there's not much funding. And Saudi Arabia has been the worst offender and continues to be. So in calculating who's our friend, I say these aren't friends we're talking about. I had a friend, his name was Jamal Khashoggi, and they killed him. And so my feelings about Saudi Arabia are pretty sore. But
we should perhaps point out that you are not allowed now back in Saudi Arabia, and you're now not allowed back in Israel. So we have.
I haven't been formally banned. I just can't get a visa.
So I think the idea that this has sort of just happened and it's haphazard is not exactly true. This is by design. In fact, if you go all the way back to the formation of these nations and sort of drawing these borders during the Sykes-Picot Agreement, there was intentional sort of effort to put a minority in as the rulers in order to keep this kind of tension constant in the Middle East. Western intervention in the Middle East has always been about maintaining chaos, frankly, in order to maintain control of natural resources.
Surely it's been
in
about
the same
promoting
way,
Western interests. So, for example, the toppling Mossadegh so you can keep control
in
of
the
oil.
same way that that's been the policy in places like Africa and South America and so forth. In 1996, there was a paper called A Clean Break. It was written by a group of neocons, Richard Pearl, Wormer, Wolfowitz, all these guys who inserted themselves into the State Department under the first Bush Jr. administration. And it was basically sort of a tactical paper that talked about taking out Iraq, Syria, and moving on to Iran, which would then destabilize, sort of obliterate Hezbollah and so forth, and any opposition to Israel. So this is not something that just happened in the Middle East, and it's not about the U.S. choosing sides. The U.S. is very much involved in maintaining this kind of chaos, and you can look. I mean. And this paper, by the way, was submitted to Netanyahu, and it was written. I mean, the neocons are all Zionists, and it's the end goal is to ensure Israeli hegemony in the region. Iran is unfortunately.
And then was presented to Bush as a new American century.
That was presented to Benjamin Netanyahu as a policy to adopt instead of reversing the kind of this sort of doctrine of negotiations, but rather reverse and start doing adopt a position of power and conquest and so forth. So, and the first step was to take out Iraq, which we saw, and Syria was on the list, and Iran. I mean, and like if you go back, even like to the Iran Iraq war. I mean, the United States switched sides 3 times. Every time the fighting would start to die down, and it looked like some quiet was going to happen, the U.S. would go and arm either Saddam or Iran in order to perpetuate the inhumanity.
To answer the question, Susan, it's hard, it isn't the West that's created Sunni Shia enmity. That is self-generated. I mean, you're giving the West, in a sense, too much agency here, surely, to suggest that they could be responsible for more than icing on the cake.
The thing is, Shia Sunni enmity is not as old as Islam. These were two sects that, I mean, when I was a kid, actually, I didn't even know there were two sects. Somebody asked me when I was 20 years old, are you Sunni or Shia? And I looked at my friend, I was like, what are we? Like, we didn't grow up with that. That did not exist. It doesn't mean that that Muslims didn't sort of know that they belong to this sect or not. But what we're seeing now is not something that was born organically without intervention and without colonial intervention and CIA coups and whatnot, and utter chaos and instability that was not homegrown. I mean, I can go through a whole list, one coup after another, starting in 1946 with the ouster of the leader of Syria and installation of Hosni Zaim in order to get an oil pipeline through. Mohammed Mossadegh, the removal of Abdel Karim Qasim from
it's really
Iraq.
not to create chaos. There were very real reasons for Western interests to reduce Mossadegh because he wanted to nationalize the oil.
Right.
And this was not to create chaos, it was to create a pro-American entity which would allow American interests to seize the oil and use the oil.
To have pro-American
chaos was not what they wanted. They wanted to be able to extract oil and make money.
Well, if you have a country that's growing too strong, like in the case of Iraq, Saddam was our friend. He was doing our bidding, right? But he was a threat to Israel, where Israel perceived him as a threat. And so that what happened there was a deliberate act to create chaos and to destroy that country, and that's exactly what happened.
Time for one more question. Any other takers? Gentleman straight ahead of me here, in the check shirt. A quick one this time, I'm afraid.
Is it working? Yes. So, given the fact that mediators are expected to have a certain level of impartiality, what do you guys feel about the role of the U.S. as mediator between Israel and Palestine, for example?
Harry, do you want to start?
Well, I don't think the U.S. is an honest broker. It's certainly in this administration. So, one would need such a thing to obtain any kind of credibility. And also, I don't honestly. Well, we'll see. I should wait until we hear Jared Kushner's plan in detail. But I'm skeptical. I can say that it might be effective.
That it would be impartial, possibly.
Yeah, it'd be impartial. But in some ways, I have to say that what Trump is doing is unsurprising, and it's probably what a lot of people in Washington want to have done. But it's I think the idea of a two-state solution is permanently dead, and now the question has to become: is there a solution, and what would it look like? My personal feeling is there's only one solution now, and it's a one-state solution, and it's going to be a very difficult thing to manage.
Susan, I'm sure you're a great believer that the U.S. is an impartial observer in this.
Larry's absolutely right. The United States has never been an honest broker. And
I didn't say that. I think Jimmy Carter was an absolutely honest broker in that case.
Yeah, and I want to point out, actually, Jimmy Carter is emphatic that Israel is an apartheid nation. He wrote a book called A Peace, Not Apartheid.
I know, and they hate him for that, but I think there ought to be a statue of Jimmy Carter in Tel Aviv. No American president has done more for that country.
I don't think that the United States is and ever was truly an honest broker when it came to Palestinians. Because if they were actually at Camp David, if Jimmy Carter was when it came to Palestinians, then and that could have been taken care of there. And yet, Palestinians continue to sit down with our tormentors, basically, trying to find some path to dignity, to live in our ancestral homeland, where we have lived for thousands of years continuously. No Palestinian came from Europe or any other part of the world. We were there when Zionists came, and and yet, you know, we're literally the only people in the world who are asked to sit down with our oppressors and try and negotiate how to get back pieces of our heritage. And yet we have done it time after time. And what Israel does is, and has continued, and we just saw in the news, I mean, is to continue to annex Palestinian land, to colonize it, to steal, to demolish Palestinian homes, to steal everything from us, to rip our hearts out. That is what Israel has been doing. And the United States continues to support this. And I believe it has more to do with domestic politics than anything else, though oil is certainly a reason.
Thank you very much. Two very different views, but fantastic coming together there. Thank you so much.